My name is Hedy Page, but actually my signature is different. When Eric and I were married, his name was Eric Pagramansky, and I became Hedy Pagramansky. He had just been liberated. 5 years later, he became an American citizen. He came home that day and he said, Hedy, you're no longer Hedy Pagramansky. You're now Hedy Page. You're married now to Eric Page instead of Eric Pagramansky. So the judge gave me citizenship. He said, it costs you nothing to change your name into one which is possible to be spoken and understood in this country. If you wait till tomorrow, when you're not granted this privilege today, it'll cost you $50 in any law firm. Who had $50? He was earning 80 cents an hour. After we were married, it became 85 cents. So I remained Hedy Pagramansky Page until 5 years later, when I was able to become a citizen. But I use it in all my artwork because we knew that was the last name left. Everybody else was killed. And so we kept it in my artwork. But legally, I'm Hedy Page. My mother always knew, because when she was a child in Poland, they ran from the Russians, and she always wanted to say who they were. And it's a wonderful book. And he grew up in a very poor, heartbreakingly poor home in Poland, deeply Orthodox, and the kind where his father would say, how can you play when Jews are dying? And they had a little store, and my father's job was, when rent was due for the store, his job was to go into the neighborhood and to any family members and borrow whatever they could spare. And then, by the time the next rental period came around, he would have paid it off in order to borrow for that month. I don't know whether it was month or year, he didn't say, but in his book he wrote everything. And it was a little store where they sold everything. And my father's job was to go and, I'm trying to use his words, I guess to the traveling salesman who had a furnished room that he lived in when he came to that town, which is a bit of history that's fascinating. And he came there and he saw the man eating. And as my father describes in his book, a pot of soup big enough to feed his whole family on a Friday night, with rings. I remember my father loved to eat rings of golden fat, orangey gold fat floating in the soup. And it was at that moment that he knew he would leave home and go to Vienna and become a traveling salesman so that he could eat like that all his life. He tried to run away from home when he was 9 years old, but they caught him and brought him back. An aunt saw him standing in line at the train station. But he was 13. He had just collected the rent money. And he looked at the money and he said, never again. I'd never be allowed to have such a chance again. And he went to the train station and he bought a ticket to Vienna and 2 bars of chocolate and a couple of oranges, because oranges were a luxury that you never saw. And he left. And he walked into his uncle's home in Vienna. And he said, Uncle, I'm going to be the best salesman you ever had. But another thing, give me room and board. And after that, any penny that you feel I earned, send to my parents, because this is their rent money, and I have to return it. And he became, as most refugees, an excellent worker. And at that time, the First World War broke out, and he was so angry about so much that he became a wonderful warrior and has a lot of medals, which I have. And he loved Vienna with such passion. The book is mostly a praise of Vienna, and that's my father's story. I was born, Vienna was paradise. We went to the park on Sundays. People smiled. There was music continually. Every stand played the Vienna Woods or waltzes. And I knew that Vienna, I was in paradise. Life was wonderful. And then it changed. Suddenly, I was not allowed to be in school anymore, because Jews were not allowed to sit next to Christian children. But I had a teacher, and by the way, I wrote about her, and if you want me to, I can email you what I had written, because he knew how to walk through the minefield and not hurt anybody. And but in that story, I also wrote how she gave us the love of drawing, all of us. So I will send that to you, okay? You give me your email.
Okay.
And in her classroom, there was no knowledge of what was happening outside. And one day, he stood in front of the children, us, and she said, I would like the Israelite children to come to the front of the room. She wouldn't use the word Jew because the word was terrifying. When I heard the word Jew, Jude, I became frightened. And she said, I would like the Israelite children to come to the front of the room. And somebody said, why a non-Jewish child? Because we expected. And she said, they are going to be going to a different school, a good school. So don't worry, come with me. I remember walking with a group of little girls, because girls were in one school, boys were in one school. They were never in any schools where the two sexes ever mixed. And we walked, and I remember the walk, and I remember going to another school and seeing children's pictures on the wall the children had drawn. And that was the end of it, because after that we were afraid to go into the streets, so I stopped school. And we went into hiding in our home. We didn't leave until the visas came from Panama. And I arrived in Panama when I was 9 years old. But when people asked me about that period of time, I always said we were saved. It was okay. And my daughter confronted me about it, said, Mom, you don't know the damage that happened. And I said, what was it? She said, you've been so afraid. All your life, you've been afraid. It's time to accept the fact that you were terrified. And I allow myself to realize the fear lasted a very long time, until I became a volunteer in the prison system. I always was a volunteer for years in anything. But when I began to counsel, I was trained in counseling. And when I realized that I understood fear because I had experienced it, and he gave me a rapport with prisoners where I didn't think, well, why did you do this or that? He didn't. And I understand that the Nazi regime, the people following it, had their own fears. And that hate comes from terror, something. And so when I was 8 years old, and I was told I couldn't go into the street, and that the people out there were dangerous, I didn't believe that because I knew the people. They smiled at me. I was chubby and cute. And so people smiled. And in the grocery store, they would give me an extra cookie. So I didn't believe. And I knew the only people, because they didn't know us, and that the only way people can hate is if they don't know. And so I decided I was going to draw a picture of everybody. And then when people would see them, they would say, they don't have to be afraid of them. My parents and I, and my brother was already living on his own. No, at the beginning he was with us also. No, we couldn't afford for us all to come. First I came. My father won the lottery. In Panama, everybody bought laundry, not lottery. It was very cheap. And he came home one day and he said, Hedy, you're going to go to America. You're going to go to art school. I won $4,000. And so there was no question about it. Hedy is going to be an artist. She's showing herself to be one. And my brother said, my sister goes. And they said, they can wait. I signed up and got accepted into Art Institute of Chicago.
Wow.
But not at the beginning. There was a waiting period. So I went to the American Academy of Art. I hated this country. It was segregated. Panama was not segregated. My first best friend was Chinese, who were not allowed into America. My friends are all colors. I came to America to go to art school in Chicago, and everybody was white. And I knew that if anybody ever came to visit me from my friends in Panama, there's no place I could go for coffee with them. The segregation was a blanket. And so I leave. I decided I would go to Israel. And the kibbutz movement intrigued me because it was pure socialism. They even told us, when somebody does something for you, don't say thank you as if they did you a favor. They're supposed to. We're all supposed to protect each other. Just do that same thing for somebody else. And unfortunately, Israel changed. And as America is changing for the worst. And I'm hoping that these things that I'm doing will make people stop being so afraid of each other. Because hate comes from fear. My husband Eric, when I first met him, it was on the way to go to Israel. We were at that time belonging to a group upstate. It was called Hecharutz HaTa'ir. And we wanted to go there. Eric had just been liberated from concentration camp. He had gone in when he was 16, and it was the ghetto and camp after camp after camp. And he had a motto that if he would if he would segregate in any way, anything, anybody, then he would belong to them. And so years later, when the kids would say to him, "Dad, can you tell us something about the concentration camp?" He would say, "There are parts I won't talk about because I don't have any desire to live them again. But there were two washerwomen, and they washed, that was in the ghetto before the camp. And the ghetto was where the Jews were brought into the worst regions, broken old houses and so on, and had to live there. Many people in each room." And he said, there were two washerwomen, German women, and they was poor church mice, but they washed the laundry for the soldiers and people in town who could afford it. And in their kitchen, there was also a huge pot where they cooked soup. And when nobody was around, no guards, they would call us in one by one and give us soup. And he said they were so poor themselves, but they did this. And that's the only story that Eric ever told the kids about that time, those years. And it's a sort of rebellion. He said, "I lived a wonderful childhood in Germany. Why should I forget that and only speak of the bad things that happened? We've got to speak of both." And what happened? Eric died about 6 or 7 years ago. And what he said before he passed away, he said, "Hedy, let's do a painting that shows who we are. Newspapers and the news broadcasts tell of any scandal. They only pick what people like to read about. But they don't know people. They don't know the people you and I know. They take the smallest segment, which is that which arouses sales. Let's do a painting of the people we know so that nobody can someday, you invented them, and get them, each of them, to say, this is how I see myself. Not how the world sees me, but how do I see myself?" And since I do that, I realize we only see ourselves as the good people and not the others. We all create others in our lives. It could be the one person who didn't open a door for us. But when people speak of themselves, they speak the truth. That's the part. And where I learned everything. They taught me how different paint looks when it dries, composition, things like that. And then finally I was admitted into the Art Institute, and I hated it. To do a human being, they paid models to stand, but those are not people. They're paid to stand. And I needed to do life. I knew that what I had to do was to show who we are, so that people wouldn't be afraid. And I could only find that in places like parks and the Bowery and the slums. And so I've got a ton of sketchbooks. I'll show you if there's time. And one day my daughter said, "Mom, what do you really want to do?" And I said, "I want to be allowed to learn more of who we are. I need to sit on a street and talk to people And so she drove me down to the Williamsburg Bridge, because I was afraid to drive in the city. And we went down the Williamsburg Bridge, and I said, Joni, she said, Mom, where do I stop? Where do you want to go? And I said, stop right here, the corner of Orchard and Delancey. And 41 paintings later, I left. I fell in love with the Lower East Side because it was all refugees. Black people from the South came there. Greeks, Asians, everybody, Jews, everybody came there. And they began in real poverty and stayed and became. And I remember when I was counseling in the Nassau County Jail, they gave me a group of young girls, and I said something about Chinatown. And one of the girls said, oh, they're rich. The Chinese are rich. They're filthy rich. And I said, really? And she said, they all own stores. They all own restaurants, so they can eat whenever they want to. And I said, do you know how they got here? They weren't allowed in here unless they had a job, and the job had to be seriously dangerous. Chinese were allowed into America to build tunnels, to dig into the waters. And later on, when the first Chinese restaurants opened, they worked in the filthy kitchens and sweated. And I said to them, why do you hate people when you don't know them? And they had no answer. It's such a joy to hate. I'll never forget, I was at home, either here or in Oceanside, and there were some workmen working across the street. And one of them said, he said, this is such a rich neighborhood. They're all no good. They took the money from us. And I said, who took it and what was it? They did not know the history of everybody who came to America, whether black from the South or Jews from everywhere or Chinese. That the feeling of needing to hate the others is what this is all about.